this morning or this evening, depending on your time zone, and thank you for your participation in the webinar addressing poverty, children's rights and Australia's obligations. I would firstly like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land which I live and work, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or other First Nations people here today. And I acknowledge that sovereignty of these lands was never ceded, and it was and always will be Aboriginal land. This webinar today is a collaboration between the Diplomacy Training Programme, Youth Law Australia, and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and it builds on a series of workshops on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC reporting and implementation of the Convention. This webinar is the fourth in a series bringing together practitioners and academic experts to develop greater knowledge and understanding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its relevance to Australia's children. So our topic today, addressing poverty, children's rights and Australia's obligations. 1 billion children worldwide are multidimensionally poor and without access to education, health, housing, nutrition, sanitation or water. 356 million children are living in extreme poverty, and children are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than adults. And children from the poorest households die at a rate of twice compared to their peers. UNICEF estimate that a further 150 million children are now experiencing multidimensional poverty due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Regardless of all of these very confronting statistics, only a very limited number of governments have set the elimination of child poverty as a national priority. The recommendations by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to the Australian Government have included the allocation of adequate resources to address the situation of vulnerable children, including for the Closing the Gap initiative and ensuring the collection of data covering all areas of the Convention. So today our expert speakers will address this topic of poverty, children's rights and Australia's obligations. And both our expert speakers have had children's participation at the heart of all of the work that they've been involved in. So just a couple of housekeeping rules, if that's okay, to mute your sound and image, and any questions and comments should be made via the chat function at any time, and there will be a number of reference documents that will be populated in the chat box for you. So firstly, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor Philip Alston, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Professor Alston is based at the New York University's School of Law. He's the co-chair there of the Law School's Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. He has held a number of very senior UN appointments over the last 2 decades, including, as I mentioned, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He's also been involved for decades in the field of children's rights and was legal advisor to UNICEF throughout the period of the drafting of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And he participated in the UNICEF delegation to the drafting sessions of the convention and has continued to advise UNICEF for several years following the convention's adoption. So I'd now like to hand over to Professor Alston to speak now, followed by our next speaker who I'll introduce after that. Thank you, Professor Alston.
Thank you very much, Faith. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to see some very familiar, friendly faces. The topic of poverty and children's rights is extremely challenging, as we are all aware. I want to want to muddy the waters just for a moment before I try to say something helpful. I want to muddy it by saying that one of the big challenges with children's rights is how they relate to adults' rights. In other words, when we were drafting the convention, the wisdom was that you could do things for children that you couldn't do for adults. You had governments who were cynical about adults who were not prepared to assist, but when it came to children, they would have to do things. We need to keep in mind the reverse of that proposition, that if governments don't have in place decent social protection for all of their citizens and residents, then why and when are they going to do that for children? Are they going to adopt a dramatically different posture? And maybe, of course, the answer is yes, because they will have some empathy, some decency, and they will take account of the vulnerability and the particular needs of children. But there's also another answer, which is that if you've got a government that is determined not to acknowledge broader responsibilities in terms of social protection for adults, that's going to greatly hamper what can be done for children. The second element to muddy the waters is the relationship between what we might call especially disadvantaged children and children in general. And one of the challenges that I think we face in the human rights area is that we tend to be reactive to the situation of the worst of children. So if there are cases of, I don't know, sexual abuse, of violence against children, of particular groups being denied certain medical care or whatever, we focus a lot of attention on those particular groups. We protest, we advocate for particular measures to be taken. But once again, if the government in question or the relevant authorities are not actually taking some sort of overall sense of responsibility for the well-being of children, it's not only going to be an uphill battle to persuade them that particularly disadvantaged and often particularly unpopular groups, children who are considered to be delinquent, children who are discriminated against because of their ethnicity or whatever. And so we are faced with this challenge of where do we direct our advocacy? To what extent can we simply cordon off children in general, or particularly disadvantaged children, and say things need to be made much better for this particular group? I just want to put that as a sort of important background issue as I see it. I think on a what should be an encouraging note, COVID-19 and the growing crisis of inequality more generally, quite apart from COVID, and climate change are three overwhelming challenges that come together to emphasize the importance of starting to adopt much more of a structural approach to the human rights challenges that we face. I think we realize when we look at climate change, although of course I realize it's not happening in New South Wales, I'm talking about other places around the world, that climate change requires a comprehensive, integrated approach where all different parts of the economy, the social arrangements and so on, are adjusted in order to achieve the necessary goals. I think the same is becoming apparent in terms of COVID-19, that we are exposing the fact that there are very large protection gaps. We're not only talking about deeply disadvantaged children who don't get access to decent schooling as a result of COVID, children who don't have access to the sort of online facilities that are all that might be available in many countries. And so there is an increasing emphasis then on the need for more structural approaches to resolving these human rights issues. It was striking that yesterday or the day before, Human Rights Watch addressed the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and said that if the US is serious about doing something about racism, it must take concrete actions towards structural change. That's the sort of language that US governments in the past wouldn't have understood. And believe it or not, it's the sort of language that Human Rights Watch itself wouldn't have used just a couple of years ago. So there is change afoot. The question then is, where do children fit into this? And I don't know nearly as much as the other specialists, particularly Sharon, who's going to speak next, about the specifics of the Australian situation. But I do want to say something about the question of voices of children, which is of great importance. My most recent experience in terms of talking with children probably came in the United Kingdom when I did a visit as UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty a couple of years ago. And there were a number of examples, but two stood out. One was a meeting organized by the Human Rights and Equality Commission in London with adolescents from inner city areas. I forget, maybe there were 15 or so there. And it was focused on questions of poverty, but also on the implications of the government's program of austerity, cutting back on all spending at the local level and so on. And the stories that I heard were incredibly informative for me, but also very evocative of what was really happening in the country. So I remember one kid said, yeah, I mean, you know, I don't hate my family, but I can't stand being with them because, you know, there's 8 people in our apartment and it's one room and we're all over one another. I've got to get out. I've got to be somewhere. Until recently, I used to go to the community centre. The government cut back the funding dramatically. Community centre has been moved. It's now a room. It's like being at my house. I'm back on the streets. It's a pity because on the streets, there's drugs and there's other stuff and it's not good. And the various children went on to describe one by one, not children, adolescents, one by one, the impacts that governmental austerity programs were having on them. And it was extremely revealing. They spoke in ways that adults didn't. They spoke of challenges that adults didn't talk about. I also met with a lot of children from a government school in Glasgow. I spent an afternoon there. I went to lots of different sessions with children of all ages. Eventually, some of those children actually flew down to Geneva and were present when I presented my report to the UN Human Rights Council. Again, very instructive meeting with the children. They, I think, got a lot out of being involved and engaged in the process. They ended up talking at school about the sort of issues, where poverty comes from, what kids in their school are affected by it and how and what they can do to change it. Final point to perhaps draw my starting and closing together is that children who are in distress and who are particularly disadvantaged, yes, we have to hear from them, we have to consult them, we have to listen to them. But again, that's not going to happen unless there is a broader practice within the community of involving children. Unless governments and others make that bigger move to say, look, we can't be making policy about such an important and such a potentially articulate group without consulting them. We don't do it when it comes to pensioners. We don't do it when it comes to trade union workers and others. And we shouldn't be doing it when it comes to children. Yes, there's a lot of challenges to work out how best to do it, but it's only once the broad principle has been taken seriously and not tokenistically that it's really going to then have the effect on the children who are the ones who are most disadvantaged. I should leave it at that so I don't go over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alston. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, and then we will have, following that, we'll have Q&A. So please do populate the chat box with any questions or comments that you have about the issues raised by our speakers. So Professor Sharon Bessell is a Professor of Public Policy and the Director of the Gender Equity and Diversity at Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Professor Bessell heads up the Children's Policy Centre at ANU and the Poverty and Inequality Research Centre. She has led the Individual Measure of Multidimensional Programme, which was developed as a groundbreaking approach to assessing poverty that is sensitive to gender, to age and disability, and it's also policy relevant. Sharon teaches on social and development policy with a focus on global context, and her research interests also focus on social justice and human rights, and she's published very widely about undertaking research with children. So thank you, Professor Bessell, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Faith. And thanks to everyone for joining today to talk about these critically important issues. And thank you, Philip, for those comments. It always feels like a big ask to talk after Philip. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got some slides to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen as I'm talking, and I'm hoping everyone can see that screen. I'm looking at Faith. Faith, can you see the screen? Great. Okay, so I'm like Faith. I'm speaking from Canberra today. I am in the south of Canberra on Ngunnawal lands, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful land, and to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Faith noted at the beginning the dire state of poverty around the globe. I'm only going to be talking about the Australian context today, but of course Australia also has a role and an obligation globally through our aid program and through other mechanisms, but I'm just going to focus on Australia today. And if you'll bear with me for just one moment, I have just had a message saying my battery is low, and so I'm going to have to just switch headphones. I'm so sorry about this.
I should maybe make an announcement while Sharon's doing that to pick up on a point that Professor Alston made. Our next webinar is on the topic of participation. So this is a key thing that we will be exploring in the webinar series more broadly as well. So I'm not sure whether Sharon's...
I think, can you hear me, Faith?
Yes, I can.
Great. Yeah. That wasn't as disastrous as I thought it might have been.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharon. Over to you.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So child poverty in Australia, I think we all know the figures. About 18% of children in Australia lived in households that were in poverty prior to COVID. We don't have an official poverty line in Australia, but we do use the OECD definition of relative poverty, which is households that are below 50 or 60% of median income. We don't assess poverty in Australia or in most countries in a way that is child-centred, that draws on the things that really matter to children and young people that Philip has already started to talk about. We don't assess child poverty based on a concept of children's rights. If we did, I think we would expect to see much higher rates. Child poverty in Australia has fluctuated over time from around 14% in 2000 to nearly 18% 2 decades later. So what has caused that fluctuation and that increase over time? There are many factors that play into this, but at a basic level, government policies are critical, and particularly harsher conditionality around benefits, particularly for single parents. So we're off to a bad start in thinking about Australia's obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the extent to which we're meeting those obligations. So poverty is a fundamental violation of children's rights. Today we're focusing on the Convention, but of course, all children, like all human beings, have human rights by virtue of being human and the right to a decent standard of living and the right to dignity. The Convention does not specifically mention poverty, but it is clear that children have a right to live free from poverty, and this is enshrined particularly in Article 27 that relates to an adequate standard of living. And I think it's clause 3 of Article 27 that becomes particularly important when we're thinking about the obligation of nation states and of governments to address child poverty. And while Article 27 is especially important, poverty, I would argue, undermines every article of the Convention. It certainly violates Article 3 on best interests, and it is in no child's best interests to live in poverty. It's also important to highlight the ways in which poverty links to violations of children's rights to protection. In Australia, reports and substantiations of neglect in particular are often intertwined with poverty. And we see a sticky web that's created by poverty, often combined with systems failures and discrimination to draw children into child protection, into out-of-home care systems, sometimes into juvenile justice systems, and sometimes into homelessness. And I think this is the kind of thing that Philip was talking about when he mentioned that young boy who felt he couldn't be at home all the time. Very often, it is the failure to address the structural and the intergenerational nature of poverty that sees children catapulted into these systems. Involvement in those systems so often creates the conditions that perpetuate poverty into adulthood and into the next generation. This is not, of course, the case for all children who experience poverty, but it is all too common. And it is especially common for Indigenous children who are so overrepresented in the juvenile justice and in the child protection systems. And here, systemic racism plays a critical and a devastating role. And increasingly, the evidence is revealing the scars that poverty creates for children, even when these worst case scenarios are avoided. So to fully understand these entwinements, we need to understand the multidimensional nature of child poverty. Income, or a lack of income, and the resulting material hardship is and always will be central to the experience of poverty. But poverty is multidimensional, and from a human rights perspective, it's essential that we recognise this. While child poverty is characterised by material lack, it's also characterised by barriers to accessing and to benefiting from services, and by barriers to fully participating in society. Child poverty is material and non-material, and importantly for children, poverty often impacts on relationships. The stress that poverty places on families impacts children's relationships with people within those families. And that has implications for the relationships with the people that children love most. Poverty also impacts on children's broader social connections and relationships, as stigma and exclusion undermine connectedness. And when we're talking about interpersonal relationships, about love and care that is so important to children, in the context of child poverty, it's essential that we recognise the structural nature of poverty and that we seek to address violations that those structures cause, rather than falling into what I would think of as a rights violating trap of blaming individuals. A few years ago, I led a research project that sought to understand children's experiences of their communities. Of the 6 communities that we worked in, 4 were disadvantaged on a whole range of ABS indicators. And the families that many of the children who participated in the research came from were really struggling financially, but in a whole range of ways. These children were aged between 7 and 12. So they were quite young. They were also very articulate. And we heard a great deal from them about the experience of growing up in poverty. Children spoke of the high cost of the essentials: housing, food, education, healthcare. And these young children understood these costs in great detail. Many also explained the strategies that they used to protect their parents: not asking for new shoes, throwing away permission slips for excursions that they desperately wanted to attend, but worried their parents couldn't afford. And for older children, already beginning to think about the cheapest subjects they could do when they reached high school. Some spoke of the ways in which the conditions of their parents' work, precarity, injury, long travel hours, long working hours, weekend work, all impacted on their time with their parents. Others spoke of the ways in which the lack of work and the lack of income made their parents grumpy and made their parents sad. They explained how they explained how lack of income and efforts to earn money and the conditions under which those efforts occurred, be it employment conditions or welfare conditionality, impacted on what they valued most, which was time and connection with their parents. And here, children's experiences align very closely with Cook and Brady's excellent 2015 review of the academic research on welfare to work programs in Australia. And that work concluded that the impacts on parents and on children were overwhelmingly negative, particularly for single parent families. And of course, conditions have hardened in the past 6 years, and they will harden again next week. Children in our research also described the shame, the stigma, and the exclusion that comes with poverty, and the pain of living with those things. So each of these is associated, I would argue, with policy failures that have seen successive Australian governments fail to uphold obligations under the Convention around child poverty. Failures around welfare policies, particularly keeping social benefits at such low levels that children will necessarily live in poverty. Failures of poverty around essential services, particularly housing, but also healthcare and education. Failures of employment policies, particularly policies that increase the precarity of low-paid workers, and failures around welfare conditionality. And alongside these policies, we see narratives that seek to reduce entitlement and to question who is deserving. So if we're to correct this, we need a children's rights lens to be used in the development, the implementation, and the evaluation of all policies that affect children. And this includes not only policies such as education and childcare that are often associated with children, but all policies that affect them. And as I've just mapped out, that's a very broad range of policies. We especially need to have a children's rights lens, and indeed a human rights lens more broadly, to call into question the policy narratives that are developed and repeated around entitlement and deservingness. Narratives that help to shape policies and that help to justify what would otherwise appear to be cruel or inhuman, or at least unjust policies. Narratives that are used to harden public attitudes. We've seen in Scotland in this past week that children's human rights through the Convention can be incorporated into policy. In Australia, our task is complicated by federalism, and the issues that I've just listed fall across both federal and state or territory responsibility. But we do have in Australia, in some jurisdictions, really important moves towards assessing policies for the impact on children. And the challenge is by no means insurmountable in this wealthy and creative country, but it will require a level of commitment that we are yet to see in Australia, a commitment that the Committee on the Rights of the Child has consistently recommended, and I think a commitment that a lot of people in this seminar have advocated for a very long time. So, to wrap up, What are the first steps if governments in Australia are to meet our obligations under the Convention? We need, first and foremost, an acknowledgement that children have a right to a decent standard of living. And we need an acknowledgement and a recognition that poverty is a common rights violation in Australia for children and for adults. This requires us to be prepared to name poverty. There's been very important progress in Australia at state level around child wellbeing, and that's fundamentally important. But to achieve wellbeing for all children, we must, as a priority, address poverty, the poverty in which about 1 in 6 Australian children are living. In some jurisdictions in Australia, there is a disinclination to talk about poverty because it's considered to be a deficit model, and it's argued that we need to focus on strengths and assets. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we begin labelling individual children and their families as poor or poverty-stricken, although our current policy narratives often do just that in the most damaging ways. What I am arguing is that if we refuse to name something, we cannot address it. So we need a serious conversation in this country about poverty, about its causes, including the causes that come from policy and systems failures, and from structural barriers, exclusion and discrimination that play out again and again. We need to embed children's participation in decision-making through multiple mechanisms. There are already youth advisory councils across states and territories in Australia, but we can and we should extend these. And one way of doing that is to develop broader spaces for deliberative democracy in which children can engage even as they are excluded from representative democracy. And we need to recognise and value the contribution of research with children that's grounded in rights-based approaches. And we need processes for the systematic review and revision of policies that I've already discussed. And we need a shift the narrative to end stigma. We need to stop blaming individuals and social groups for the poverty that is not of their making, but a result of inequality, patterns of exclusion, and policy failure. So in sum, we need recognition of children's human rights, including the right to participate. We need accountability from governments, and we need respect for children's dignity. It's quite an agenda, but it is an agenda that a wealthy country that values fairness can achieve. And it is one that we must achieve if we are to fill Australia's obligations, the obligations that we've made under the Convention, not just to a committee, to the UN or to the international community, but a commitment that we have made to children in Australia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I think we have a lot to discuss now, and both have kept to their time allocation impeccably. So we have lots of time now for questions and discussion. And just turning to the chat box, Jill has made a comment in relation to structures. So she's asked, should we not use structural in another sense? So the structures being discussed, and rightly so, are resultant of a combination of, firstly, the political structures. So she states voting every once in a while is neither democratic nor per se, in a real sense, participatory. And number two, the capitalist structure, which inevitably challenges our thinking, resources, and even our advocacies for and against change. So any thoughts about Jill's comment there in relation to structures, Sharon or Philip?
I can go first at that if you like. And so I think they're great points that Jill makes.
Excuse me, it's Gil.
Oh, Gil, I'm sorry.
I do apologise, Jill.
Okay.
I can see you now, Gil. So I can. They're great points that Gil makes. I think that both of those issues are important. I think we're certainly seeing in Australia at the moment, with some of the discussions around the nature of Parliament, some of the shortcomings of the democratic system that we have. There are some very interesting things happening in Australia, particularly at local level, around deliberative democracy practices, around ways of drawing in communities broadly to decision-making processes, and then local representatives behaving quite differently based on those interactions with their constituents. A colleague of mine here at the ANU, Carolyn Hendricks, has done a lot of work around this and has looked particularly at some really exciting things that have happened in the electorate of Indi. The point that I made just in passing, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to pick up on, is that children are often excluded, not just from our processes of representative democracy, but also from those emerging processes of deliberative democracy. And so that's one way of both changing the nature of people's participation, but ensuring that children can be included in those processes. And your second point is an enormous one about sort of structures of neoliberalism. I think we do have an opportunity at the moment to, because of COVID, to really rethink some of those macro structures, and particularly some of our macroeconomic structures and what we value in society. There are some really important conversations happening around a wellbeing economy, or what I think perhaps we should call a wellbeing society, that could shift that. And we see some interesting things happening in some countries, in New Zealand, in Iceland, in Scotland. We don't see a political commitment to those kinds of shifts in Australia, but there is a really important emerging global conversation. And I think we have a moment in time in history that we could use to take advantage of beginning what we need to do to shift to a more just global society, a more just global system.
Thank you, Sharon. Professor Alston, would you like to comment on Gil's question?
I mean, I think Sharon has done a great job. I would only, I guess, add that one of the big debates in the human rights area these days is whether human rights norms and whether the human rights movement have the capacity or the will to challenge neoliberal economic structures. And I think we do, you know, sitting here in New York, this is a very particular moment with the Biden administration talking about producing this week or next, not just the $3 trillion infrastructure, etc. Bill, but increasing taxes significantly on the wealthy, and actually trying, I think, to challenge at least some of the worst aspects of neoliberal policy. And what is surprising is that human rights groups are actually starting to respond in those terms. But I think it's very important for others to be aware of that. In other words, it's not sufficient, at least for human rights movements in the aggregate, to simply be advocating on narrowly defined human rights violations, but rather to be addressing these deeper structural dimensions without which we won't eliminate the individual violations.
Thank you. Kate has asked a question. She's speaking from the UK. I wonder if approaching poverty through a child lens can be a double-edged sword. While people tend to be more sympathetic towards children than adults, there is also a common view that children are their parents' responsibility. Indeed, parents feel this, hence shame around seeking help. And she also says here that would a universal basic income approach be better to tackling systemic poverty? Philip, perhaps would you be able to maybe reflect on your time in the UK and any comments in relation to Kate's point?
Yes, I mean, I think the first point she made, that there is a risk that if we try to change what I shouldn't call welfare policy, in other words, broader social protection policy, through the lens of children, it brings with it a certain paternalism, because governments are prepared to pat children on the head and say you shouldn't be without food, but they are not prepared to address precisely the issues that Sharon so systematically and well presented. So I think that certainly is a risk. The second part of the comment related to
universal basic income approach.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Poverty?
Yeah, I mean, again, sorry to be so US centered, but the Sharon's equivalents over here are in much higher spirits than she is, because unlike what the Morrison government is doing in terms of the imminent cutback and the return to punitive conditionality for ideological reasons, the US Congress has finally given this child benefit across the board, and that will do more to reduce child poverty rates, which have been very high in the United States, than almost any other initiative possibly could. When we talk about universal basic income, that debate goes bad very quickly because it's simply unaffordable to have the comprehensive universal basic income. But I think that that such a philosophy can work its way through a great many other approaches that are indeed very viable, and the sort of appropriate family child benefits and so on are an important part of what I would understand as a universal income policy.
Thanks, Professor Alston. Professor Bessell, do you have any reflections or comments on Kate's questions?
Perhaps on the, I think on the broader point that if we only focus on children in addressing poverty, I think we will run up against some very serious challenges. And certainly paternalism is possible, although we also see a number of governments that don't seem terribly concerned about the fact that children don't have enough to eat. But I do think we need to understand the way in which the structural nature of poverty impacts on children as it impacts on adults. And that's in a very broad number of ways. In regard to basic, in universal basic income, I think these debates are actually really important because they're helping us to focus on how we can address some of these challenges and how we can reimagine societies being structured. So I think those discussions are fundamentally important. As Philip noted, there is a really serious issue around how we fund universal basic income. But alongside those debates, I would really like to see us also focusing on universal essential services. Because I think, you know, income is one part of the story, but so is access to healthcare, to education. In Australia, housing is an absolute crisis. And I think that discussion around the right to and ensuring that everyone has essential services is a critical part of the discussion that we can't miss by focusing on income only. Not that income's unimportant. And I think we saw in Australia and in many countries during the COVID lockdown, the challenges for children, but for people of all ages, of not having internet access, which is now also an essential service that people are to connect, particularly in times of pandemic. So I think that's a conversation we really need to have.
Thank you. And just to follow on from that, Katie has asked about children's participation. So would children become a greater political priority if we lowered the voting age? So teenagers in Australia can leave school and drive long before they can vote. So Sharon, have you any thoughts about the voting age in Australia, and should that be lowered? Do you think that would have an impact on the political agenda here?
I think when any group's disenfranchised, they are less likely to be able to shape the political agenda. being able to vote doesn't necessarily mean a group will be able to shape the political agenda. So it's not a given. In work that I've done with young people about not around participation, not necessarily voting age, some have argued that they don't necessarily want to vote at a younger age, and sometimes that's because of a disillusionment with politicians. Some young people have argued very strongly that they do want to vote. I think in Australia, at least, we have a way to deal with that, and that is to have compulsory voting, which I think is a very positive thing for a democracy, to have compulsory voting for the age of 18, but to introduce a lower age at which young people can choose to vote if they want to vote and engage in the system. And so it gives young people the option to begin voting at the age when they want to begin to participate. So I think I would like to see that kind of discussion taking place in Australia.
Thank you. We've got another question and statement here from Lizelle. Apologies if I've got that pronounced incorrectly, but when systems can be so slow to change, how can we ensure the process of participating is meaningful and fair for children? It can damage trust when children engage in participatory processes, offer their perspective and share what they would like to see, and then don't see any change as a result of that. Professor Alston, you mentioned about, as your work as UN Special Rapporteur, that children were very much at the heart of, gathering evidence, but also the reporting processes and that experience that you referred to, of the children in Glasgow. Have you any reflections or comments in relation to, meaningful participation rather than often what children refer to as quite tokenistic mechanisms?
Tokenism is always a problem, of course, not just with children. And it's a very fair challenge. It's not about children, but I still have this vivid memory of sitting in a very poor conditions in an outdoor camp in Spain, in the south of Spain, talking to migrant workers from Africa who were picking strawberries. And I was there to talk to them about their conditions and their experience. And I was expecting a productive conversation. And the very first comment was, why the hell should we waste our time talking to you? Idiots like you come and talk to us, you exploit us, never makes any difference at all. Why don't you go away? And I think that certainly applies also to children, that the chances of any one-off consultation, as it were, is not going to, the chances are that it's going to be tokenistic. If there's no structure involved, if there's no process where the interlocutor says, look, this is what I hope to do with this. This is why I want you to help me and how I think your thinking and so on could be fed into the system. I think there's a real obligation to structure it in such a way that it does move beyond the tokenism.
Thank you so much. I certainly, reflecting on research that I've conducted where children will say that they haven't heard back from people. I think that, children, in my experience through research, know that, that these processes take time or complicated, but even feeding back to them what you've done with what they've said and how you've utilized it, where that information has gone to, I think, that is definitely an obligation that we all have. Sharon, you also have done lots of research, like Professor Alston, with children and young people. Have you any comments in relation to that, fair and meaningful participation, feeding back to children, but also, being realistic about, change can be slow, it can take time. There may not be instant results from the process.
It's a great question, and I think there are so many layers to that. And I think the comments that Philip made, I think, resonate so strongly with me. I had a similar experience as a researcher asking young boys living on the street in Indonesia about their views, and they were fairly quick to say that they didn't really want to talk to people who weren't going to make any difference to their lives, and understandably so. I think one of the issues here is being very clear about what the participation's for, what it means, and being very transparent with children and young people about what this process is and what it may or may not achieve. Over-promising or implying too much, I think, is really problematic. Children and young people, in my experience, are often really keen to share their views if they know why they're sharing their views and what's going to happen. But I think the other part of this is that we cannot kind of use participation as a cop-out to just get children's views and then say, well, here it is. Children cannot solve some of these deep structural problems that we're talking about. So yes, we need to have spaces for children to participate. We need to understand what their experiences are. But ultimately, action and changing those systems comes through leadership. And it comes through governments and others who are in positions of power. So I think we should never use children's participation to kind of mask over where change can actually come from. And some of these issues, children can't solve, obviously. And I think the other part of this is I will always argue that children's participation is fundamentally important. But on many of the issues we're talking about, we actually know what the challenges are from children because they have told us again and again through research and other mechanisms. We know from people living in poverty what the challenges are, and we see the failures. So at some level, this is also about action rather than continual consultation or participation.
Thank you. We have a question from Patrick about accountability. So while it is the federal government that is accountable for implementation under the CRC, it is arguably state and territories that have the greatest areas of policy responsibility for children, and the knowledge of the CRC is the least. This is reflected in the CRC's most recent concluding observations to Australia. Are there any good examples of the CRC and human rights bringing about good changes in policy approaches and outcomes for children? And do you have any suggestions on how state and territory governments can be more engaged on human rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Sure, Sharon, would you like to go first, if that's okay?
I think that's a great point. And of course, federalism in Australia often complicates everything, but federalism is sometimes used as an excuse to complicate things. But we also see examples of federalism working quite well. I do think the process of developing the national framework for protecting Australia's children is a good example of governments at all levels in Australia working together and bringing in civil society organisations to develop that framework. Now that framework has now ended its first action plan of 15 years, and we're moving into the next action plan, and that process has been slow because of COVID. But I think that gives us an example, and now that is setting a broad framework rather than around the delivery of services. But that's an example of state and territory and federal government coming together to make a very clear commitment. Now, what we haven't seen is that commitment translating into better outcomes for children who are in the child protection system. So we've got a gap between the way that that framework was developed. We see the influence of the convention in the development of that framework, but we've had a very serious gap in implementation. Across a number of state and territories, we now have charters of rights for children, particularly in out-of-home care, but in some other contexts as well. Again, we see an implementation gap, but we're seeing the convention influencing at state and territory levels as well. We see in the ACT an explicit rights-based approach, and policies, all policies in the ACT being kind of put through a children's lens. So we're seeing some movement in positive directions. It's quite slow in coming, but I don't think federalism is necessarily a reason that, that we can't move ahead. It's often used as an excuse, but we see often more movement at state and territory level than at national level. So in some ways, the states are driving the children's rights agenda.
Thank you. Thank you both to our speakers for their presentations and their reflections and comments on the questions. We have lots of other comments in the chat box as well, and some people have been sharing resources which hopefully you can all access. I'd now like to pass over to Matthew Keeley, who is the Director of Youth Law Australia. He's going to thank our speakers and conclude the session for us. So thank you both again from me, and it's been really a very interactive and interesting session with lots of really, your both discussions mentioned lots of action points for us to think about. Now we have this evidence that we know we have, and about the continuation of pushing for change. So I'd like to hand over now to Matthew, who's going to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Program, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights and Youth Law Australia, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on the webinar today. It's my particular honour to thank both Professor Philip Alston and Professor Sharon Bessell for today's presentations. I was so pleasantly surprised at the congruity of the presentations, and in particular around the position that both speakers took on the interrelationship of children's rights and broader human rights lenses and approaches, children's participation, the need for a broader structural change approach, and a really clear call to action that there is a need for a serious conversation about poverty in Australia. And I think we can all agree that the language of poverty has fallen largely out of our social and political discourses in recent times. I'd also like to thank Faith, our moderator, coming to us from the ANU College of Law, acknowledge her co-moderator, Noam Peleg of the UNSW Faculty of Law and Justice, who couldn't be with us today, but who participated in the formation of today's webinar. And of course, in this series, we always give great thanks to our friends at the Diplomacy Training Program, Andre and Claire, who put together such magnificent webinars. And we thank you for all the work you do between times. Lastly, I'd just like to note that we are planning another webinar in the last 2 weeks of April. And as Faith mentioned, that will be on the issue of children's participation very specifically. And of course, we've talked about that very much today. And we look forward to sharing with you our very exciting speaker for that next event. But Faith has kindly handed over to me to also close out this session. So ladies and gentlemen, lastly, again, I'd like to thank you for joining us. I know you've come from all over parts of the Indo-Pacific, indeed North America and Europe. The time zones have been carefully calibrated by our colleagues at the DTP to allow you all to be here. And for joining us, I'd like to thank you and formally now close the webinar on behalf of DTP, YLA and the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. Thanks everyone and goodbye.
Oopsie.
Bye, buddy.